But I want to go into another area, which is one of the hot topics in the world today, but also in teaching today, which is AI. You were sort of mentioning, bringing newspapers into classes, and students in the digital age have never touched a newspaper.
But I think that's my thing with AI. It's a great tool to use, and it's about how we weave it into what we do in our thinking and our work. If we become reliant on it, if students are using AI to write their papers and professors are using AI to grade the papers, then none of us really needs to show up. It's out there, it's changing the world, but we can't let it take over the world.
I'm so impressed with that. Welcome, everybody, to our OGL podcast and YouTube video series. I'm always so happy to just talk to you about whatever's going on in the world, but also to have amazing guests who can talk to us about their amazing work. And so in this particular series or session, it's my pleasure to introduce Todd Cherches. Todd and I have been becoming friends over the last couple of years. We're both members of Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches, and I've just so enjoyed getting to know him. Todd and I were also, can't remember if we were together back in the many, many years ago at NYU, Todd, but it's been such a joy to get to know you now. So Todd is the CEO and co-founder of Big Blue Gumball, which is an innovative New York City-based leadership development and executive coaching firm. Okay. So again, talking about both the leadership development and consulting part, but also the coaching part of this. And as I mentioned, he's a member with me of Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches. And he's ranked with Thinkers 50 and Thinkers 360 and Global Gurus 30 and the Powerless 200. I mean, Todd's a 3-time award-winning adjunct professor of leadership at NYU. And also a lecturer of leadership at Columbia. And again, he and I have taught at both of those places. And so it's just so fun to sort of be with you and thinking about that history. Todd's also a TEDx speaker and author of the groundbreaking book, Visual Leadership, Leveraging the Power of Visual Thinking in Leadership and Life, which is published by Postal Press and Simon & Schuster. And so please, everybody, join me in welcoming Todd Cherches. Thanks for being here, Todd.
Doug, thank you so much. Yeah, it was great that we probably crossed paths. Maybe we were even in the same room at the same time at some point and never met until we met through the Marshall Goldsmith 100 Coaches group. But yeah, we both span the coaching world, the academic world, and yeah, looking forward to a fun conversation. We definitely will have no shortage of topics to discuss. I think the key is what not to talk about, because we have so many things that we can talk about.
Well, and I think that's a good point, because we do have so much to talk about and we have limited time for our viewers and listeners, but there's really important stuff here. You're an executive coach, an author, a keynote speaker, a professor of leadership at both NYU and Columbia, but tell us more about what you do.
Sure. And the unifying thing is leadership. And a lot of times we mystify leadership and put it up on this pedestal. I bring it down to the base level that even if you're leading your life and managing your life, you're a manager and leader, right? And I always say that to my students on day one. I'll ask, raise your hand, how many of you are leaders? No one raises their hand. I say, in tonight's session, we're going to redefine leadership and what it means. And we talk about, you manage processes, you lead people, but it starts with leading yourself. Peter Drucker said that a long time ago, right? You need to manage oneself, lead oneself. So I think it's very empowering for anyone, but especially for students, to feel like I'm not going to become a leader. I don't have to work my way towards becoming a leader in 30 years. I could lead starting today. I said, leadership is about stepping up to leadership when it's needed, and it's always needed. Right? I talk about 3 V's: visibility, voice, and value. That's about being seen, being heard, and making a contribution. That you don't need to have someone tap you on the shoulder to do that. You just need to raise your hand and say, I'll do it. Or you start a movement, start a community, and it starts with yourself. So just redefining what it means to lead is very empowering for people, but especially for young people. So those are just a few thoughts on leadership. I know we share similar sensibilities when it comes to servant leadership, and leadership is about serving others. It's not about being served, right? So it's just about how we frame it.
I love that, Todd. And I always say to my students, similar to the way you start your classes, I don't do the thing, who's a leader, but I always ask them, who are their the leaders they admire. And most students will say, Nelson Mandela or, whoever. And I'm always amazed. And at least one person in the class will say, my mom. And I'm like, okay, I want to focus on the student who just said my mom, because leadership is not about the position that you're in the corporate world. Leadership is about how you make the lives of the people around you better. And you've written about this a lot, but I've written about this in what I call everyday leadership. And so servant leadership, everyday leadership, I love it. I think you and I have the same ideas about these things.
Yeah, one of the chapters at the end of my book, Visual Leadership, is called the 10 tough questions every self-aware leader needs to be able to answer. And just real quick, it's how do you personally define leadership? Who are some of the leadership public figures who you admire? And that's where you get the Martin Luther King and Steve Jobs and people like that. The next one is more in line with what you're talking about. Who are some of the private figures who've taught you something about leadership? That's where people talk about their high school teacher or their parent or grandparent or whatever. And then we talk about, what defining leadership moments in your life. What are you passionate about? The question that comes from a book of this title, an HB article, why should anyone be led by you? I say people need to be managed by you if you're their boss. They only have to be led by you if they choose to follow you. So why should people choose to follow you? So reframing. And so I'm not going to go through all the questions, but those are top of those 10 questions that most leaders never really think about. Right.
Well, and again, it sounds like you and I have so much of a similar approach to how we start our leadership classes, and I'm so moved by that. But so we've seen the cover of your book, and it's beautiful.
Right.
But so give the audience an overview of the book, Visual Leadership. Tell us what it's about.
Sure. Well, visual leadership is basically, at the most simple level, it's the application of visual thinking to the practice of leadership. And what is visual thinking? It's about thinking in imagery as opposed to in words and numbers. As leaders and managers, we're so often consumed with the data and facts and figures. I always say there's 3 F's: facts, figures, and feelings. People are not motivated and inspired by facts and figures. They're motivated by feelings, right? So how do you translate those facts and figures into something that's inspirational and motivational, right? A company's mission statement, your vision statement, they need to be motivational. Saying, we're going to increase shareholder value by 3.7% this quarter. That's not what makes you leap out of bed in the morning, right? If whatever it is you do for a living. So what is that? What is that change you're making in the world? What are you contributing? What gives you a sense of passion and purpose in the work that you do? So a big part of visual leadership is about I break it down to 4 categories: using visual imagery, mental models and frameworks, metaphor, and storytelling. So it's the incorporation of those 4 visual thinking-oriented methodologies to the practice of leadership is what I teach and what I coach and what I help people to do more effectively. So my catchphrase is, how do you get people to see what you're saying, right? You have an idea in your head, a vision, right? We always talk about having a leadership vision. A vision literally is having a picture that you could see in your mind's eye, a picture of a future state that's different from and better than the current reality. But step 1 is formulating that vision. Step 2 is communicating that vision in such a way that it gets out of your head and into the heads of others. So most people are not great at that. And that's one of the things I help people do, whether in my classes or in my coaching practice, tell people to get their ideas out there into the world to help change the world and make those visions a reality.
So that's amazing, Todd. And it's just so exciting to hear you talk about this. And again, you and I have similar ideas about how to start the teaching of leadership, but I've gone in the direction of the VAMI framework, vision, alignment, motivation, introspection, and you've gone in a different framework, which is, this notion of how do you help people with visual thinking? So can you just give us a little bit of background on how you chose to focus everything around this topic?
Sure. Well, the quick version is, first of all, I talk about this in my TED Talk. It's actually the opening of my TED Talk. When I was 5 years old, people would say, Todd, what do you want to be when you grow up? We always ask kids that, right? I said Superman. And they said, well, that's great. That's, Superman's amazing, because I was obsessed with television, child of the, 70s, 60s, and 70s. If you can't be Superman, what's your next choice? And I said Batman. So those are my only 2 career options at that point of my life. And I finally realized that those jobs were taken and they were fictional. So the next best thing was to work in television in some capacity. So I was an avid reader. I was obsessed with the Hardy, if you remember the Hardy Boy mysteries.
Of course.
And I read the Golden Book Encyclopedia from cover to cover, from A to Z. So I was an obsessive reader. And I was an English literature major as an undergrad, and I studied poetry and Shakespeare. And I was like, what do I do with that? Combined with my love and passion and obsession with television, I said, all right, maybe I'll work in TV in some capacity. I had no idea what the jobs were, producer or not director, but network executive, something like that. So my dream was to work in television. So my first job out of college, I got my bachelor's degree in English literature and my master's degree in communication. I interned at NBC News in New York. I grew up. You can tell I'm from New York if you can't tell by my accent and how fast I talk. I am a New Yorker, although I'm an extreme introvert. So sometimes people find that contradictory, being an introvert and talking as fast as I do. But my brain works faster than my mouth tries to keep up. So I did an internship at NBC News. I worked on the NBC News. My job the summer of 1984 was to write obituaries for people who hadn't died yet. So that was a really interesting, eye-opening job for a college student, because if someone passes away and they get their obituary on the or profile on the air immediately, it's like, how does that happen? They're already done. Other than the cause of death, for all famous people, I worked on obituaries. Some of these people are still alive that I worked on back then. So that was my first intro to TV and media and everything else. And then I moved out to LA and I got a series of entry-level jobs. I worked for Michael Nesmith of the Monkees, who baby boomers know, and my younger students have no idea who that is. And then I worked for Aaron Spelling on Dynasty, just again putting scripts together. And then I was in casting at Columbia Pictures, comedy at Disney, and drama at CBS. So those were my years in the TV industry, all in administrative jobs. And the common recurring theme was horrible bosses, one bad boss after another, dysfunctional teams, horrible bosses, and toxic cultures. And I said, there's got to be a better way to work and to live than to spend the next 30 years of my life dealing with this. And I discovered management leadership books and I started reading them obsessively. Those seeing this on video can see my book collection. I've been reading an average of one business book a week since 1998. So I'm well over like 1,300, 1,400 management leadership books. So I'll stop there. I worked in project management for a while and then I moved back to New York and I ended up with a job at the American Management Association. And that's where like the light bulb went off, metaphor, that there's a whole way of management and leadership can be taught and needed to be learned. And then ever since then, I've been in the management leadership development space. So that's my bio in a nutshell, which is an idiom. So again, metaphors and idioms are all part of visual thinking.
Well, Todd, thank you for sharing all that. And it's just a magical story. And I just want to highlight a couple of things for our audience who thinks about things like leadership. And you and I have talked about, like, when we walk into a class, are you a leader? Are you not a leader? Are there, are you thinking of a corporate leader? Are you thinking of, a person local in your life, your mom, your dad? But there's also, again, these different frameworks to think about this, right? And so you could think about strategy, alignment, motivation, introspection. But because it sounds to me like, from your background of having been not just a visual person, but actually having worked in the industry that is really producing visual things, whether it's writing obituaries for people who will die at some point, or actually working in the TV industry, then you brought together those two things about how you think about the visual world and how you think about how to help people be leaders. And that's, I love
my mindset, my paradigm is storytelling, right?
Yeah.
So stories have beginnings, middles, and ends. There are villains, victims, and heroes. There's a quest or a goal. There are obstacles or challenges that stand in your way. There's a journey. There's an outcome. There are lessons learned, right? So that's the framework Joseph Campbell talked about, right? The hero's journey and myths and everything else. It's the same thing for any business, any leader, anyone. Our whole lives are. If you think of yourself as the lead character in your life story, go. Right. Who are the villains, victims, and heroes? What's your goal? What's your vision? What's the standing? Yeah. How's the story going to end? Right. So I see everything through the lens of story. So when I'm coaching clients, a lot of times that storytelling framework helps people to think through their issues and challenges and what is it similar to, and are there lessons from The Godfather you could take, or from Lord of the Flies, or Lord of the Rings, right? Or whatever. It's like, we live in a world of story, and so if that's your mindset and that's your framework, that's how I help people to see and envision happy endings to their life journey story. So
it's so beautiful. I don't know if you know my former boss, who was, at one time he was at Harvard and was trying to recruit me there, and then trying to recruit me to the Yale School of Management. Then eventually, when I was fired from my deanship at GW, Joel Podolny was the founder of Apple University under Steve Jobs, and so he was like called me, and I went to work for him. But one of the amazing things that's so similar to what you're talking about, Todd, is there was a course we had at some point that was about storytelling, and as a leadership guy, I was like, why are we teaching storytelling? We need to be teaching vision, strategy, motivation, and but Joel had this brilliant insight that was like, no, actually, if you're going to be a good leader, you have to tell stories about why we are where we are and what we're doing, and we have to teach people storytelling. And so it's very similar to what you're talking about, and it just sounds like you guys would get along with
I
each
don't know
other.
him, but yeah. I mean, as humans, we are wired for visuals and we are wired for story. Like, they're just ingrained. And storytelling. A lot of times we elevate it to this lofty. If someone says, "How was work today?" and you said, "Oh, you won't believe what happened to me," you're about to launch into a story, right? Kids tell stories, grandparents tell stories. Culture was passed down through storytelling long before the written word was even invented, right? So, and think about cave drawings that go back to 40,000 BC. People are writing, drawing, and painting pictures on cave walls to tell a story. You may have left a note saying, "Hey, I went out to shoot a buffalo for dinner." That's the story that you left on the cave wall that's still around. But again, that's just, if you were a cave person walking through a jungle and you heard rustling, you turn around and see, what is it, right? We use our senses to take in our environments and to make sense. It's sense making, right? We try to make sense of things and try to find solutions and solve problems and innovate and things like that. It's so ingrained in us as humans. It's like sometimes we make it more complicated but seeing it through different lenses, like through the lens of visual imagery or through the lens of storytelling, it's a way of bringing things to life and inspiring people to action.
Todd, it's beautiful, and you're so articulate about how you describe it. It's amazing. But what I'd like to do, so thank you for sort of the introduction to the theory and how it relates to your book. But I'd love to hear more about your teaching at NYU and Columbia, and like how do you do that? Like, how do you make it all work together?
Sure. Well, I never envisioned teaching. Like I said before, I'm an extreme introvert, and I was always terrified of and terrible at public speaking until I was around late 30s, early 40s. Actually, just before I turned 40, because it was just before I met my wife. I took a public speaking course because I was kind of like in between jobs, and I needed something to motivate myself, and it was a skill that I didn't have, and I felt it was holding me back. And it inspired me. I realized I was better at it than I thought, and it wasn't as scary as I expected it to be. And now I've done a TED Talk, I do keynotes, I teach at 2 universities, I won 3 teaching awards. I never could have envisioned that years ago until I kind of got pushed into a couple of situations where I had to present. I tell one of the stories in my book. I was working for a management leadership company, and I always was behind the scenes, and I was always in awe of the presenters who, mastered the stage. And the idea of going from backstage to on stage was such a huge leap for me. I never pictured being in front. And then we were doing a leadership program for 12 CEOs in Hilton Head, South Carolina, and the instructor didn't show up. He was sick, he missed his flight, and I was there that morning with the participants, and there was no one to facilitate this 3-day workshop. And I called my boss back in New York, and I said, "What do I do?" He said, "Well, you're going to have to do it." And I was like, "Excuse me, I think there's something wrong with the lines. I think I heard you say that I need to do." So he said, "You know the content, and like we have no other option, like other than sending people home and being," so he said, "Do not let them know that you've never done this before." I was so terrified, I didn't even know where to start, but I knew the content, and I did the exact opposite of what he told me. Instead of saying, "I've never done this before," I said to them, "Here's the situation." So authenticity, truth, reality. I said, "I've never done this before. You're all leaders. What suggestion would you give to someone like me who's been thrown into this situation?" And one of the CEOs said, "How are we going to help our friend Todd here be successful?" All of a sudden, it was the best. If I had designed that opening, I never would have even thought of it. But I threw it out to them. I trusted, and it ended up being so great because they immediately were thrusted into leadership roles, and it became like a self-led group. And it turned out the instructor got there the next day, and I was I was disappointed because I enjoyed the first day so much that he took over day 2, not having any idea what went on in day 1. But that always stayed with me, because they could have all grumbled and said, we got this guy who's never done this before. They could have stormed out and demanded a refund. They did the exact opposite. I thought that was such a great example of leadership in action, of leaders springing into a situation. So I just love to get your thoughts on that. But that was my very first time I was ever thrust into that situation. And it was a happy ending that came out of it.
Well, thank you for asking for my thoughts because two things immediately came to mind. Um, when I was back young and rising star of the leadership field and blah, 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 I was like always trying to tell like all the companies I've advised and blah, blah, blah. I'm trying to be awesome.
Yeah.
And then when I was fired from my deanship, it was a devastating moment in my career. But I decided, like, okay, Doug, you could wallow in your sorrows, or you could figure out how you're going to use this as a way to be a better teacher. And so I became a much more vulnerable teacher. And so now when I teach leadership, I always tell the story of getting fired, and I always tell the story of the mistakes I've made. And I get emails from students that are like, Professor Guthrie, I can't believe what you have told us. And so I do believe that there's an issue of vulnerability in teaching that, so I love that you kind of made the switch. Like you didn't
Yeah.
do exactly what
Yeah, I
you're
took a risk and it worked. It could have backfired on me. It
could
didn't.
have,
But that's a great example of
but
using just to hit the pause button for a second. I told that story, and I haven't told that story in a long time. But that's a great example of leadership storytelling. Someone could say, "Wow, if that happened." So what can I take from that? And then you connected your story to it. So I think that's nothing. Stories connect us on a human
right,
level and inspires others. Like if you're willing to be humble and vulnerable and share your story, that inspires others to let down that facade and get off the pedestal and just come bring it down to earth and being that authentic leader that's lurking inside you and not being about your title and your hierarchy and looking cool and being powerful. It's about being real, you know.
right. The other thing that just connected me when you were telling that story, I love the term, Todd, leadership moment.
Hmm.
And I always use that with my classes. So when somebody does something in the class, and these are just MBA or management students at the Thunderbird School of Global Management, like they're 27 years old, they're not thinking of themselves as leaders. But when somebody does something that I perceive as like a way that they influence the class, I always love pausing and saying like, hey, person, that was a leadership moment. You just did something awesome.
Yeah.
You just made that other person feel really good about what they were being vulnerable about. And thank you. And so I love this idea of like being vulnerable and creating a space for vulnerability, but also, and it's not about creating a therapy class, but it's about being vulnerable, but then also encouraging people to create safe spaces for people to do other things. And so I really connect with everything that you just said.
And I always say to my students that leadership lessons are hiding in plain sight right in front of us if we're only aware enough to see them and look for them. You can, one of the things I do is I'll take, in fact, I wrote, if you Google New York Times and my name, Todd Cherches, you'll find an article I wrote for the New York Times on how I incorporate the news and current events into my teaching. And one of the things I'll do is I'll bring in the paper. And so many people students have never even touched a physical newspaper ever for many years. It's like, oh, I'm going to get ink on my hands. But I'll just give out rip out pages of paper, and I'll say, find a leadership lesson from the page you were just given. And it's a trick question because every single article, if it involves people, it involves leadership. So it doesn't matter whether you got the sports section, entertainment, business, science, whatever. There's a leadership lesson hidden in
Right.
every single article. So again, it's just shifting people's mindset to think of leadership in a new way. So, but just going back for a second, so that was the first time I was thrown into a leadership a presentation public speaking session. I attended a Dale Carnegie training. Not only did I get through it, but I got hired to be a Dale Carnegie trainer, which has launched my leadership training career. And then a colleague there hired me to Jeff Schwartzman hired me. He was hired to be the chief learning officer of a Wall Street company, and he hired me to create a leadership institute and executive coaching program. So it was my first real full-time job doing that. And then I met at a coaching conference. I met someone who taught at NYU, and she said, "Have you ever thought of teaching at NYU or teaching at all?" I said, "No, never." She introduced me to the dean, and they hired me to teach my class that I've been teaching for the last 15 years. And that led to my teaching at Columbia, and that's how I ended up teaching. So it's not something that was ever on my bucket list or my career aspirations. It was just, it happened organically and seamlessly. And that's what I love is the fact that I tried that, it's a whole other world, as you know, right? The business world and academic. There's a lot of overlap, there's a lot of differences, but that's how I started teaching. So it was not on my to-do list. It just happened.
I love that, Todd. It's such a great story, and it's a great journey. I want to pivot a tiny bit. I mean, you were sort of mentioning, bringing newspapers into classes, and students in the digital age have never touched a newspaper.
Yeah,
But there's another group of people who have probably never touched the New York Times.
yeah,
And I think a lot of your students, maybe the majority of your students, are international students, maybe primarily from China.
yeah.
And so I'm just curious, I'm a China guy, and so I think a lot about this, but I'm curious how that has affected your teaching.
Yeah, I mean, I teach in the NYU School of Professional Studies in the divisional programs of business, and it happens to be just evolved over the years that about, I don't know the exact percentages, but something about 70 to 80% are international students, with majority of them from China. I get a variety of other countries as well. But yeah, it's opened my eyes to a new perspective, to hearing, because we talk about storytelling. If you're a 25-year-old female from Beijing and you may be thinking, oh, what do I have to say in this class? Or what can I teach my professor? And one of the things I always say is, I've never been a 25-year-old female from Beijing, so anything you say is going to be new. And right. So learning from, just as we could all learn from each other, and we're all leaders in different ways. Yeah, sharing your stories with us is a way of understanding people, their culture, connection, the lens through which they see the world. One of the things I have had to shift is, I always talk about that being stakeholder centered. Marshall Goldsmith has stakeholder centered coaching. When you're teaching, we need to speak the language of our stakeholders, right? So if I'm telling, using a baseball analogy or a Seinfeld reference, then students from other countries, other cultures are not going to get it, right? So it teaches us to try to see, it's part of the visual thinking too, see things through the lens of other people, right? So it forced me to be more creative in coming up with ways of connecting. So if you use a nature analogy, for example, getting to the root of a problem, branching out in new directions, seeing which ideas bear fruit, going out on a limb, right? Those are all tree analogies. So we may be picturing different trees, but we both get what we're saying, as opposed to if I'm speaking, talking about something that's you don't relate to, you may lose the other person. So again, it teaches you to customize and modify your communications, and you have more experience than I do in that. It's to connect with other people, meet them where they live, right? Not expect them to meet you where you are. So again, it just forces you to be more creative and more open-minded, culturally, generationally, really in every possible way, to try to connect with other people so that we get each other. We're trying to create understanding, right? So, yeah.
And just one quick footnote on this. Do you find that the visual leadership themes resonate with the international students?
Yeah, using the power of pictures I have numerous examples, surrounding me on my desk. So, for example, even if you've never seen Gumby, for those of you watching on video, for those of you you've never seen Gumby, I could still use this to say this represents being flexible as a leader. In what ways do we need to be more flexible or bend over backwards to serve our clients, right? I keep my Curious George on my desk to remind me to always ask why and to dig deeper and to see things, and sometimes to kind of cause some trouble, right? To shake things up a little bit. The fact that there's no magic wand solution, we actually need to do the work. So these are examples of using visual props that help to trigger ideas. And sometimes people think it's stupid or silly or juvenile, but you know what? It's memorable. It cuts through the clutter. And I talk in my TED Talk about ACR, attention, comprehension, and retention. In today's world where we're overwhelmed by information, how do you capture people's attention? How do you create understanding? And how do you get people to remember? When you use visual imagery, visual language, metaphors, and stories, you're going to stand out from the crowd. So that's part of what I do in my teaching and in my coaching, is help people to, one, get ideas out of their head and into the world and into the heads of others, but also cut through the clutter so that people, if you say something but people forget it 3 minutes later, then did you have any impact? So how do you get that idea to that stickiness, and changing people's mindset? That's a big part of what I try to do. So yeah, so that's a great point, is that visual imagery will cross cultural and language barriers in a way that words alone do not. So that's one of the strengths of taking a more visual approach to what we do.
I love that, Todd. And so, I mean, this is just such a rich conversation, and we've hit on the cross-cultural stuff that I deal a lot with. But I want to go into another area, which is one of the hot topics, in the world today, but also in teaching today, which is AI.
Yeah.
And how do you deal with this issue in your courses, and how do you teach about it? Like what, I mean, and just so you know, as an aside, a couple of years ago, my dean asked me to be the co-chair of the AI committee. And I was like, Dean Cogram, you don't want me. Like, I'm a Luddite. I hate this. Like, I hate what's going on. I think it's destroying. And he's like, no, Doug, we do need you because we need a Luddite. And I'm going to pair you with the person who's like the leader in this. And it's been a great journey for me, Todd, because I've learned so much.
Yeah.
We're at a big moment for society, but also for higher education. So I'm just curious how you're thinking about this.
Well, sometimes I use this metaphor. Math teachers thought this, a calculator was the enemy, is the devil, because students will not have to learn math if they could just, So it's a similar kind of analogy, right? I have seen some shifts. I have seen a decline in thinking skills and writing skills over the last couple of years because when you become reliant on the technology, like real life example, a student handed a paper that was obviously written with AI because the language was much better than he or she spoke. I asked a question about something he had written about, and it was completely, he had no idea what I was talking about. I was kind of like, it's bad enough that you didn't write it, but did you even read it? Right. So that was my reaction going through my head because it's so easy to put a prompt into AI, spit it out, and hand it in. One of my executive coaching clients asked his assistant to do some research. The kid came back shortly with a couple of pages of information that was inaccurate, that wasn't relevant. And he said, I could have done that, right? I needed you to do some critical thinking. In my book, I talk about 10 different types of thinking. Critical thinking, analytical thinking, integrative thinking, all these different ways of thinking. If you're just mindlessly generating content based on prompts and not really filtering it through a lens or saying, all right, is this accurate? Is this relevant? So I think that is the biggest issue. So AI does amazing things. In fact, I'm going to be delivering a presentation skills workshop in a couple of weeks. And just for curiosity, I just put in the prompts of what I needed to do. And it basically created an outline of what I was planning on doing, but gave me 2 or 3 new ideas that I hadn't thought of before. So it was great. So as a tool to supplement and enhance what you do, it's amazing, or to do the background research, but it shouldn't, it shouldn't take the place of our thinking. It shouldn't take the place of our writing. When people say, I have friends who are authors, I've written my 800th book. It's like I just put a prompt into AI and say, write me an 300-page book on this topic. Did you really write the book? Right. So again, is it semantics, or is it really about, we want to hear what people think. Do we want to hear what the robots think? So not to be, I'm similar to you. I'm usually a late adopter with technology. It's out there, it's changing the world, but we can't let it take over the world. So I think that's the key. It's a tool that's amazing. I had to generate a visual for me the other day that would have taken me hours to create. It did it in 3 minutes. So it wasn't perfect. We had to fine tune and tweak it. But I think that's my thing with AI. It's a great tool to use, and it's about how we weave it into what we do in our thinking and our work. But if we become reliant on it, then I said to someone recently at a faculty meeting, if students are using AI to write their papers and professors are using AI to grade the papers, then none of us really needs to show up, right? So how do we keep the humanity, because I teach in human capital management, how do we put the humanity back into human resources and human capital management, and don't forget about the people, the people side of things. So that's just a few thoughts on, it's here to stay. So it's like, what do we do with it now with that as the new, the new reality?
I just a quick couple of footnotes on this. 3 or 4 years ago, when I was sort of asked to be a part of this, and I was like, Dean Cogram, you don't want me to do this because like I'm just the anti-AI guy, and so I would do this thing in my course where I, day one in my China course, I would ask the students to go to AI and tell me why Apple's the most profitable company in the world, and and write me a 1-pager, and then they would have the course with me, and then at the end of the semester, I would ask them to go back and look at their thing and realize that, oh my God, AI didn't know what Professor Guthrie knows. Oh, and I would usually have a shtick about like, and by the way, if you're just using AI, like, first of all, just citing from AI and not citing it is plagiarizing. But your parents are paying money here for you to be in college to make your brain synapses work better. And if you're not doing that, you know, but I realized my approach was a little bit narcissistic because I was wanting them to see like, oh, class with Professor
I'm
Corey is
smarter.
like
I
getting me
know
more
more than the
information.
robots. Yeah.
So I've changed my approach to realize like, okay, we can be hardcore on the fact that we want to build connections between your brain synapses. And so we want you to be smart. So you can't just use this. You have to cite things. But if I'm sending people out into the market and they don't know how to use AI responsibly, then I'm not doing my job because this is the future. And so it's been an interesting journey for me too. And it's
one of the things I do in my class, a lot of faculty, a lot of people debate about like leave your laptops at the door or leave your phones, put them in a basket and you'll pick it up on the way out. I do the opposite. We're so attached to our phones. Like if I say, here's a quote by Peter Drucker, right? Who's Peter Drucker? Instead of my telling you, take out your phone, look up who Peter Drucker is, and let's see who could be the first. So I call it iPhone scavenger hunt.
nice.
So what I do is instead of saying you can't use technology, I actually have them use it. So, because they are going to use it anyway. So instead of making it cheating, but you still need to explain. So take 3 minutes to look it up, read about him. Now who can explain who he is and why he's an important thought leader in the history of management leadership. That takes some thought, right? To be able to synthesize and articulate that answer. That's what you need. That's a skill you need to develop. So when you're in a meeting at a company or with a client or whatever, so rather than saying no technology, I say yes technology when approved and when necessary, because you want to practice using this. It's a tool, right? So to pretend it doesn't exist does them a disservice. So I agree 100% is that you don't want to hold people back. One of my coaching clients was talking about when I was at IBM in 1980, I just held up this dinosaur and I said, you think you're impressing people with your knowledge, and other people are thinking this person's going extinct. They're a Tyrannosaurus or a Brontosaurus or whatever. So just again, as a visual metaphor, you don't want to be or sound like a dinosaur when you're complaining about these kids today or back in 19, whatever. Again, it's part of that mindset is you need to stay current, and you may not necessarily need to be a technology leader, but you don't want to be one of those people who say, it's just a fad, or that's gonna, the internet's gonna go away, or AI isn't going anywhere. So we need to accept that reality and say, all right, how can we leverage it while still keeping the human side? In that New York Times article I mentioned, I talk about an exercise I do with my students. It's called the learning triangle. They have to connect the dots between the class content, the outside world or external resources, and their own lives and life experiences. So AI can't do that, right? And you also want to motivate people to want to do that, not just that I can't use it, but I want to not use it because I want to be creative. I want to express myself. So if we're talking about the differences between management and leadership, I'll say reference another book or article that explores that same topic. And the other corner of the triangle, give me an example of talk about the best manager you've ever had or the worst manager you've ever had or the best team you've ever been on or the worst team you've ever been on. When you connect the dots, it forces your brains, like you're talking about, is to connect those synapses and think critically, analytically, integratively, and connect the dots. So, and Steve Jobs, right, he famously said, we can't connect the dots going forward. We can only connect them looking backwards. That's what we're trying to help students do, is connect the dots between what we're talking about in the classroom, what's happening in the outside world, and what they've experienced or will experience in their own lives. So again, that's where we need to be creative and combat. Otherwise, we'll be replaced by the robots, right, if we don't make ourselves valuable.
By the way, I just want to call out for our viewers that your visual leadership is not just a metaphorical thing, because you have props in your office. You have
my desk is covered filled with them. Yes,
a magic wand and a dinosaur and Gumby, and I'm so impressed with that.
We have to discuss one of my clients was avoiding the main topic. I said, you're not addressing the elephants in the room. And again, it's funny and silly, but again, you're not gonna, because business is serious. We're all under so much stress with what's going on in the world. If you can lighten the mood, I think that's where my comedy background comes, my years of working at Disney and developing sitcoms and things like that. That's where I integrate some of that background, the storytelling and the comedy side, is that if you make things fun and keep them light, we're more innovative when we're not stressed, right? So if you could reduce the stress through creativity. I wrote an article for Inc. magazine called Can You Draw What Your Company Does? And it's based on an exercise I do with executives. If you had to sit down for 5 minutes and illustrate without speaking what it is that you do and how you're different from and better than the competition, what would you draw? Some people draw like a mind map or a storyboard. Other people draw like stick figures or a metaphor, but it leverages a different part of your brain, the creative side of your brain, to help to communicate an issue or a challenge that you're facing. So I have articles in my book about chapters about how do you use napkin sketching, how do you use props, how to use metaphors and stories. So again, these are all tools that any of us can adopt to enhance our leadership.
I love it, Todd, and it's just amazing. And I'm so inspired by this conversation. But as we're getting close to the end of our time, I want to. So your company, Big Blue Gumball, focus on management training, leadership development, team building, executive coaching. So what are some of the key issues and challenges that your corporate clients are facing these days?
Yeah, I mean, there's a lot of different ones, but some of the common themes, and I go across industry. I do work a lot, being here in New York, a lot with financial services companies. I do a lot with healthcare and pharmaceutical companies. The whole return to office versus work from home versus hybrid thing that emerged out of the pandemic is still a hot topic. The whole, is
Okay.
it 3 days a week? Is it 5 days a week? One of my clients was saying, I have to commute 2 hours from Long Island to New York, sit in a cubicle, and I'm on Zoom all day, and then I turn around and go home. I just spent 4 hours on the train for what? Right? So again, how do companies make it worthwhile for people to come into the office? What are the pros and cons of that? So that's a hot topic, is where we do our work and when we do our work matter in today's global world, right? So that's a hot topic. AI, as we just talked about, technology. And one of the key ones is generational differences in the workplace, right? And that relates to everything from technology to work ethic to style. What happens when you're 55 years old and your boss is 35? How does that turns the quote unquote natural order of things on its head, right? How do we adapt to that? How do we create cultures of psychological safety and mentorship and community and collaboration in a world of diversity, where all the rules have changed? So I think these are some of the hot topics that my clients are wrestling with. And trust. I'm doing a 2-day in Silicon Valley in October. I'm waiting for the exact dates. A 2-day for a pharma company on trust. So because trust has really declined over recent years. Trust not only is what they're saying to me truthful, and can I believe what they say, but do I trust our leadership? Do I trust that my job is still going to be around 6 months from now? So the idea of trust has risen to the top of the list. So those are some of the key topics that my corporate clients are wrestling with these days.
I love that. And these are all such important topics. And you and I clearly care about similar issues. We've come at them from different directions, but I'm hearing all of the same stuff. I mean, it's just really, these are important issues. And just to, again, sort of reframe them for our audience, we've talked about, sort of the cross-cultural issues. We've talked about the technology issues. We've talked about the generational issues. We've talked about post-pandemic commuting issues, and then you map onto those things like trust and questions of whether or not people understand where they're going in the workplace. And so
like employee engagement, the scores haven't improved in the 30 plus years that Gallup's been doing the surveys, right? Why are we doing all this work and engagement and people are disengaged? Or, there's a hot topic recently on TikTok about, should you give 2 weeks notice if you're leaving your job? Many people, they're doing the right things and giving 2 weeks notice, but then they're being told by the employer, well, if you're leaving, today's your last day, pack up and you have to be out by noon. So the next person who leaves, who doesn't give 2 weeks notice, they're accused of being disloyal and leaving the company hanging with no opportunity to replace them or train their successor. So what do you do? Like, I think so many of the rules of the past have changed. That, how do you dress at work when, younger people, some of them, I'm not stereotyping, but real life story, coming in dressed inappropriate for an office environment, or knocking on the CEO's door and saying, can I talk to you for a second, as if they're knocking on their parents' bedroom, saying, can I have the keys to the car, right? So just I think just over recent years, it's like all the rules have changed. So we need to kind of like reevaluate what the rules of the present and the future are going to be. So I think it's created opportunities for people like us to educate and to coach other people. But a lot of the old ways of doing things aren't relevant or appropriate anymore. And so we need to look at things using a visual analogy through a fresh new lens. I would say managers look through a microscope, leaders look through a telescope, and innovators need to look through a kaleidoscope. So those are 3 visual metaphors I often use. But we need to, we both wear glasses, right? When you change your prescription or you put on a new lens, you see things more clearly or in a different way. Some people have rose-colored glasses, and some people have dark frames lenses that they can't even see through. So again, all of these, it's all about seeing the world through a new lens and seeing future possibilities that maybe we haven't even envisioned yet.
Amazing, Todd. I'm learning so much in this conversation, and it's brilliant. So my final question for you: it's been such a gift to me to get to know you over the course of the last couple of years in our coming together in Marshall Goldsmith's 100 Coaches. But specifically for you, how can listeners learn more about you and your work?
Sure, thank you. Yeah, so first of all, I live on LinkedIn, so feel free to just say, I saw your conversation with Doug, connect with me on LinkedIn. I'm always posting relevant content related to what we talked about today. Also, I have two websites. My company website is bigbluegumball.com, but my primary website now is my toddcherches.com website, where you can watch my TED Talk and see more about my book and learn more about what visual thinking is all about. And then if you want to check out my book, Visual Leadership, it was just translated into Mandarin and will be released in China. I'm waiting for the publication date, but hopefully before the end of this year. So that's going to open up a whole new market. And one of the reasons they were interested in the book is because this visual approach appeals to people of all cultures and all languages. And it's just, again, a new way of looking at things and problem solving and innovating. So I hope people will check out my book as well.
I hope so too. And Todd, it's just been such a gift to develop a friendship with you over the last couple of years. Feels like our careers have been winding around each other. Finally, we're here. But I'm also just so thankful for you for giving our listeners time. I care so deeply about the issues that you're talking about. And so just getting to not just talk about visual leadership, but also just talk about your general philosophies and ideas about these things is just a gift to our listeners. And so I want to thank you so much.
Thank you. You just said the keyword care. I think both of us, that's one of the things that really bond us. We're not dialing it in or going through on autopilot. We really care about leadership and the future of the world. And I think that comes through with everything that we do. So I think that's one of the things that connects us to the humanity approach, and also the fact that we seriously care about the world and the future, and that impacts all the work that we do. So thank you for having me and allowing me to share some of my thoughts and approaches today.
Thanks for being here.